Hello, I hope you are having a fabulous day. Today I want to talk a little bit about writing discussion questions. So tomorrow when you come to class, we will be having a quick book club discussion with your groups, probably 15 minutes or so. We are about halfway through our memoir book club time, so we want to check in and talk a little bit about what we're noticing, what seems interesting, and have some conversations. So our goal when we're writing discussion questions is to have questions that inspire enjoyable and deep conversations. So we want to try to write questions that are going to make people think and going to make people talk. If you've ever had a really boring book conversation or a really boring conversation in any way, you know that it's not very fun, right? It's not very interesting. You don't get a lot out of it. We don't want our book club discussions to be like that. We want them to be conversations where we leave them and we feel like we have gained understanding and we have had a good time. So we need to think about some things when writing questions if we're going to succeed in that. So first, we want to consider what we already find interesting. Our jots are a great place to start. If you do not have any jots, that is a major problem. I highly recommend pausing this video, going to read for a while, jotting about what you're reading, and then coming back to this video and back to your discussion questions. If you are not jotting about your reading, major problem. That is going to affect your understanding in a negative way and affect your ability to talk about the book. You want to have jots. Jots are so powerful in having a good conversation and in growing your thinking throughout the book. So make sure you have jots. So we can consider our jots though. If you're jotting a lot about characters, then you probably want to ask some questions about characters. If you noticed like a really good quote or a really good passage that you really liked the wording of, then that's a place you can start for a question. There's tons of different things that you can do when you have jots. It makes it so much easier to write really good discussion questions because you already have a place to start. All right, the next thing we want to do is we want to create open-ended questions. We want to avoid yes-no questions. So open-ended questions are going to be things people need more words to answer, right? That's going to inspire more conversation than just a yes-no question. If I ask a yes-no question and we all just go around the circle and say yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, that's really boring, right? Like that's not an interesting conversation. We can make a yes-no question interesting by asking why and focusing on the why if we're going to ask a yes-no question. So if you want to do that, that is fine. You're just going to want to keep in mind that you want to focus on the why if you've asked a yes-no question. All right, next one, you want to ask questions that you have ideas about. So you don't want to do is just find like what you think is a really Englishy sounding question and ask it because you think, oh, this is a smart sounding question. No, that's not going to work. So for instance, it would not be a good idea to ask like, how does figurative language affect your understanding of the story if you have not noticed any figurative language in the story? If you have absolutely no idea about a question, it doesn't seem relevant to the book, don't ask that question. So you should have some inkling that this is going to be a relevant question, that it's going to be an interesting question, that you have something that you can say about it. Because if you have something to say, chances are other people might also have something to say. If you're like, I have no idea what anyone would say to this question, don't ask that question. Next, we want to think about the elements of stories that you've learned about. So we've learned about character setting, identity, and perspective. You could ask questions about any of those things. You've probably also learned about theme and author's craft and where all of these things intersect in different ways. So you can think about any of those elements. So if you're really stuck, a place to start is to be like, okay, well, why don't I ask a question about character? And then say like, okay, do I want to ask a question about the main character or about a different character or about a relationship between characters? And then you can form a question from there. based on some of the elements that we've kind of learned about. And then our last tip is to be specific. So rather than asking a really broad question that could be asked about any story, so like if I said, how does the setting affect the character, right? I can ask you that about literally any narrative. So instead, you should be more specific. Is there a specific setting you want to think about and a specific character that seems more interesting? Is there like a comparison between two characters and two settings that you want to make and talk about more? So the more specific you are, the more interesting that's probably going to be to talk about, rather than just kind of like, how is the setting affecting the character? And then everyone kind of goes around and answers their question, right? Or kind of gives their answer. That's not going to be super interesting. But if you're like, well, how does moving from here to here affect the main character? That might get you a more interesting conversation. So let's look at a couple examples that I wrote for my current book. I am reading Spirit Run by Noe Alvarez. It's a memoir about Noe Alvarez and his decision to join an indigenous run across North America. So I am not super far into it, but I've read enough that I can have some discussion questions. So if I was having a discussion about this text, here are some of the questions that I might ask. So first, I said, Noe seems concerned that his life is already mapped out for him. Have you ever experienced this fear? Why might this fear affect Noe so deeply? So one of the things that is apparent really, really early on in the story is that Noe is really concerned about sort of where his life is headed. And what he's going to do and what options are available to him. And so that seems like something that would be really interesting to talk about. I have experienced similar anxieties, so I'm just wondering if other people have. I think that would be interesting to talk about. I would like to know what other people have experienced in relation to that. I'm also interested to think, like, is there a reason that this fear might affect Noe more deeply than other people in some way? Or like, why is it affecting him so deeply? What is it about his life that causes this to be a deep concern to him? And I think that would be really interesting to talk about. And I kind of got that from my jots, because a lot of my initial jots were about this idea. But you can see how that's a very specific question. I didn't just say, like, what is the main character worried about? Because then I just kind of get a straightforward answer, right? We just look at the book and say, here's what he's worried about. Instead, we're kind of asking about that worry a little more. All right. Another question I wrote is, as Noe joins the runners, he begins to learn about the spiritual traditions of the indigenous runners. How are these spiritual practices changing Noe and his outlook on life? So as the book continues on, we start hearing a lot about these spiritual traditions of these indigenous runners and this sort of like feeling of this run as a spiritual practice. And so I'm wondering, like, how this is going to change Noe and his outlook on life. Is it going to affect him deeply? I'm guessing that it is, but I'm wondering, like, what other people are seeing so far. And then my last question is actually a yes-no question, but is Noe making the right decision when he leaves college? And then I would want to focus on the question of why if I was talking about this with a book club. So Noe decides to leave college. And as a person who obviously values education, I think that education is important, but college is not necessarily the best option for all people, and it's not necessarily the education that everyone needs or wants. So I'm just wondering, like, what other people think. Is Noe making the right decision, and like why? And what's going to be like the result of that decision, do we think? So those are some of the questions that I am really interested in. So you can see how I sort of used these tips to write some good questions. So what I want you to do today on your Jamboard, add several questions about your book that you and your book club can discuss. Go ahead and add them all to like one new page on the Jamboard. Use your color sticky note so that you know which questions are yours and which aren't. And don't repeat anybody's question. So if you have a question and somebody else has already written that, write a new question. All right. I think that is all I have for you. Have a fabulous day. I will see you.